Today we have Lydia Dake, who is a therapist at Holistic Child and Family, who's going to be doing our presentation. Thank you, Lydia.
Thanks, Ellie. Hi, yes, my name is Lydia. I use she, her, and they, them pronouns. I am an associate clinician here at Holistic Child and Family, and this is my first time presenting for the ND consult, so I'm very excited to be here. Today, we are going to be talking about sexuality and sex ed for neurodivergent humans. I'll get my slides up in just a moment, but I'm really excited. This topic has been a real passion of mine for a long time, over a decade now, where I've had a really, kind of grander scheme interest in sexuality as a whole. It definitely has been a special interest. And so I'm very excited to get to kind of info dump at y'all about this thing that is very exciting to me. My background is in clinical psych, and then I just received my MSW from the UW in June. I've been really enjoying working with neurodivergent folks of all ages, and I think that this stuff that I'll be presenting today is applicable to a wide age range. So I'm going to get started and share my screen. Let's see. Share. Let me know if you can see this. Screen sharing. All right. Thank you, Ellie. Okay, so yes, like I said, today we're going to be talking about sexuality and sex ed for neurodivergent humans. I'm going to open this just kind of by talking about like the why. Why do we need inclusive sex ed? And I'm going to be looking at this kind of from the larger scale of disability on the whole. I think that the way that we as a culture kind of approach sexuality with the wider disability community is kind of similar to the more like neurodivergent community. So I think this is applicable really to disability communities at large. So one major thing is that disabled folks make up the world's largest minority group, around 15%. And it's pretty clear out there that disabled folks are less likely to receive adequate sex ed, sexual health care, and then they're more likely to experience sexual assault and trauma and stigma around sex. I think that there can be kind of two narratives for disabled folks in general around sex, either that really kind of infantilizing one that they're too pure and can't be exposed, and this other narrative that if disabled folks are exposed to sex, they're going to turn into these wild, sex crazy, really just like sex crazy people that are going to do inappropriate things, which is just false. And it really takes away from people's right to their sexuality and to enjoy their sex life in the way that like feels good to them. So I think it's really important to just address this as a part of life. Something that I learned in a disability justice class in grad school, somebody brought up sex as an activity of daily living, which for many folks it is. It's something that happens, it comes up regularly in many people's lives. And so to include sex when we're looking at ADLs really is part of holistic care, right? If we're going to just kind of eschew sex out of the care that we're providing to clients, we're really just cutting out a whole part of someone's life that could potentially be really fulfilling. So as it stands, this what I'm pulling from was about OTs in particular, but I think many health professionals really don't feel comfortable talking to their clients about sex. And that aversion, I think, is really doing folks a disservice. Lack of sex ed means that people aren't going to know about safety and about boundaries. And, it's really like having this inclusive sex ed is going to both be protective against abuse and trauma and also really liberating to allow people to experience their life in the most full way if they want to. So this list here, it's from the ARC's Autism Now. It's called What Does It Mean to Be Sexually Healthy? I think that this list is a kind of great benchmark for, if you're working with someone who really wants to explore and expand their sexuality and their knowledge of who they are as a sexual being. I think these are great kind of benchmark questions to ask. So this list ranges from the really basic stuff, anatomy and how to care for your anatomy, and pregnancy and STIs and that kind of thing. It talks about healthy relationships and boundaries, and kind of the broader scale do you know that you have the right to your sexuality and that your sexual feelings are normal and okay? So I think this list is a nice kind of broad range of things, really covers kind of a holistic range of what sexual health can look like. So I think this could, frankly, could be a nice checklist to go through with someone if they're really interested in diving deep into their sexuality. So this next bit, we're going to touch on kind of the relational aspect of sex and sexuality, because that is, that's an important part, that relational aspect, but we're going to touch on this and then move along. Most of this presentation is going to be about like the sexy stuff. So one thing I think that we were at Holistic we're talking about is that the boundaries between types of relationships, platonic, romantic, sexual, what have you, can feel a little bit more fluid when you're neurodivergent, at least in many of our experiences, anecdotally. Neurodivergent folks can have rigid thinking behaviors, but I think in terms of like categories and stuff, they can also be kind of flexible and expansive. And so I think there's importance in really getting granular about what do you want out of relationships, and how might other people perceive that, right? What's the difference between being nice to a friend and flirting? That's confusing. And so kind of, allowing yourself to go kind of get deeper with that about like, what does that look like and how does that show up for like what you want in a relationship, I think is very important. And then looking at consent, some research has shown kind of a couple of different categories of what consent can be seen as. So we have the internal willingness, that thought of like, this is what I want. Explicit agreement, that, verbal or just explicit yes consent. And then inferred willingness, which is, maybe the person who is asking for consent is inferring, seeing cues that maybe are not like directly communicated. And so this gets a little bit sticky because there is somewhat of a gender divide apparently in how consent is perceived. So this was, I believe, a study looking at young adults or maybe teenagers, and it found that femme-identifying people were more likely to indicate like a lack of consent or a withdrawal of consent through nonverbal cues. So perhaps like pulling away, things like that. And masc identifying people tended to expect a verbalization of that revoking of consent. And so this can get sticky, especially for neurodivergent people who struggle with communication or communicate differently from neurotypicals. So I think it's really, really important to consider how to ensure that you are both giving and like asking for consent in an enthusiastic and affirmative way. And I will touch on this later. I'm excited about this bit, but I think a great way to kind of get that into practice is to create scripts if they work well for your client or you, to create scripts both in a verbal way and maybe nonverbal with signaling and things like that to really express, ask for, indicate consent. This video is 3 minutes long. I think I'm going to try to play it if as long as this PowerPoint embedded will allow me. Many of you may have seen this video about tea and consent. And oh, you know what? I don't think I shared my screen with sound. So this is going to be in the, you'll be able to access this video in the slides after the fact, but it's a great video about tea and consent and kind of all of the different ways that consent can look. So for example, offering someone a cup of tea and they say yes, and then maybe you bring them the tea and they've decided they don't want the tea anymore. You're not going to force them to drink the tea because they don't want it. And so it's kind of a, removed from the like thinking about sex aspect of it and just a really like easy to access, I think, example of all of the different ways that consent can look. So this is a great resource. You'll be able to access it if you, I believe we'll be sending out the slides after the fact. Would definitely recommend to watch. And then the last bit that I have here about healthy relationships and boundaries, consent, that kind of thing, are these two different wheels. So you may be familiar with the power and control wheel that is common in domestic violence spaces. It's this wheel on the left here. This one is gender neutral as well. Some of them are gendered. So this one uses non-gendered language, but this is kind of the different facets of what power and control in unhealthy or abusive relationships can look like. And then on the flip side, we have the equality wheel, which is kind of the opposite of that, showing the different facets of what a healthy relationship can look like. So I think that I definitely wasn't as familiar with the equality wheel as I was with the power and control wheel, but I think they pair together really nicely to show both what an unhealthy relationship and a healthy relationship can look like. Okay, time to get into the sexy stuff. And by that, I mean hygiene. Sexual health and hygiene, it's important even if you're not having sex. And that's something I think that we, as a puritanical society, tend to shy away from. We get really hush hush about what the names of our genitals are. We don't want kids to know that for some reason. And yet, not knowing how to care for those parts can lead to lasting health problems. So it's really important, despite the discomfort that we may experience in talking about this, that we're open with people about the accurate names of their genitals and how to care for them. And this applies to people who are having sex and people who are not having sex and anything, anywhere in between. So some examples of not sexually active sexual health and hygiene are how to clean your vulva, wiping front to back, and using soap on your vulva but not up in your vagina. Things like pulling back foreskin to clean your penis. Those kinds of things are not obvious and intuitive to people necessarily, and if we don't tell them, then how are they going to know? And these things can lead to health conditions and health issues down the line. So even things like, what do you do if you develop smegma? And I'm using all of these terms, right? Because who would I be doing a sex education talk without using these, anatomical terms? So I think there are some other kind of noteworthy hygiene tips for sexually active folks that are not necessarily obvious, even if they may seem obvious to, people who've been having sex for a long time. So things like peeing after sex, that's something that comes in commonly that like folks maybe don't know to do. And like cleaning sex toys after each use. So if someone is having fun on their own and exploring their body through masturbation with sex toys, they might not know that you should probably clean those off afterwards. And so kind of getting really frank about that is quite important. Now we are going to get into the kind of more specific considerations for neurodiversity affirming sex ed. So this is really I'm looking at this particularly through an autistic lens, but I think this applies to neurodivergent people on the whole. And I think this can apply to everybody in a lot of ways. If we just got less shy about talking about this kind of stuff, I think there could be a lot more openness and confidence for a lot of people in their sexuality, no matter their neurotype. But I think these are particularly important for neurodivergent folks. First and foremost, it's really useful to just ask if somebody wants to talk about sex and maybe give them an out if they're not ready, including, if you get into the conversation and then they decide that they don't want to have it, give them an out. I think this is just, important for rapport building and that kind of comfort and being client led. And also it's great modeling for asking for consent and respecting the consent that is received, or if it's not given, or if it's revoked later in the conversation. It's a really great example to model just being able to respect somebody's no. And then the kind of obvious, I feel like, but understanding public, private, and appropriate times and places for sex, particularly with maybe kinks like exhibitionism and voyeurism. Not everybody considers the consent of the public around them when they are exploring these kinks, and maybe they just don't think to. So that's an important thing to really talk about and make sure that is clear for all parties involved, because that can, get folks into trouble if they are trying to explore a kink and not considering the consent of the people around them who are not involved in the sex act. And then this one I think is really maybe the pinnacle, is knowing what to expect. And I'm sure if you work with neurodivergent folks, we're curious and we're blunt and we want to know everything. So it might be uncomfortable to start out, but it's really important. Get specific, get detailed, be as frank as kind of they're willing to get, mirror how willing people are to get like frank and honest about this kind of stuff. Like I said, we don't know what we don't know. And so it's important to like provide that information so people have full access to the like myriad of pleasures that they can experience, or maybe the ones they don't want to experience. So things just like giving a list of potential sex acts. Maybe people don't know even some kind of more basic or vanilla things that you can do in the bedroom or wherever you're having sex, and maybe they'd be really into them. So giving that access just to open people's eyes up to what's possible, I think is really great. And kind of another piece of the expectations is to explore what the individual is looking for. You know, maybe they don't know, and that can be really useful to explore what kind of sex do you want to have, with who and when and where. Maybe, you know, some folks maybe want to have that loving, connected, romantic relationship. Maybe somebody just wants to have sex and they want to go see a sex worker and somebody who's going to, you know, connect with them in the moment, and then that's it. And so really getting detailed once again about what do you want, what's going to make you feel really good, and to build that confidence, right? That our people can go out into the world and know what they want, which also means they're going to know what they don't want and be more ready to say no, and you know, take their consent away and know that that can be respected. Another really important thing for neurodivergent folks is the sensory experience of sex. We talk about it mostly, you know, you hear about that it feels really good, maybe it hurts sometimes, but we don't really go further into the sensory experience than that all the time. And that tends to be kind of colloquially, anecdotally from our practice, something that a lot of people are surprised by when they start having sex. So, you know, what things are you going to feel and maybe smell, maybe taste, and getting frank about, you know, vaginas have a smell, and different people have different smells and tastes, and how are you going to, you know, what's that going to be like for your individual sensory profile. And I think something really useful to kind of bring into that discussing the sensory experience is figuring out how to accommodate. So if messy, sticky, you know, slippery stuff feels bad on you, keep a towel nearby, maybe leave the towel on the bed or whatever surface you're doing it on. Dim the lights if it's really visually overstimulating, ways to kind of help you regulate your nervous system so you can enjoy the sex in the moment. And then lastly here is communication. Like I said before, in the talking about boundaries and consent, it's really important to make sure that people feel super well equipped to give their consent, to deny consent, to revoke consent, to make sure that people are having the best experiences that they can, and to prevent people from falling into situations where they're being abused, because we're really doing a disservice, like I've said before, to disabled folks and neurodivergent folks by preventing them from accessing that information of how to really lean in and give their consent or take that away. So building scripts ahead of time is a great way to do that. One of a really great piece of advice that I saw recently was for folks who like really do utilize echolalia in their communication is to find movies and TV shows with like juicy, sexy consent lines and base your scripts around those, right? If that's an easy way for you to communicate, then it's a great way to kind of build scripts if you can find media that has like really affirming consent lines in sex scenes. So I think that's just a fun like thing to practice and could be a really fun thing to explore with clients as well. This is Dr. Lindsay Doe. She is a great sex educator on YouTube. And she put this video out a couple years ago about sex and autism. It's 12 minutes long. I'm not going to play it, but I did want to include it in the show for folks to take a look at afterwards if you would like. So Dr. Lindsay Doe, she's a clinical sexologist. She's been doing sex education online for quite a long time. She identifies as autistic, but in this video, she worked with a lot of autistic people to discuss the nuances of sex and autism. I think this video has some really great practical tips, including that piece I just said about finding consent scenes in movies and TV to build scripts around consent. So I would recommend this video. I also recommend her whole channel. It's called Sexplanations. She is really frank, really curious, and just really excited to talk about sex. So she was an inspiration for me as I was kind of picking out a career path, I would say, and I think she's got a lot of great information out there. And then this is one of the things that I'm the most excited to talk about, which is the overlap between kink and queerness and neurodivergence. I'm certainly curious if y'all have noticed this in your own kind of circles, in your own experiences. And I'm also excited that I've been seeing some kind of actual data come out about this. So we're seeing a higher correlation of gender and sexual orientation diversity among autistic and neurodivergent people. It's, I think I saw a statistic that maybe around like half of autistic people identify as non-binary. I'm not totally sure on that number, but there is a wider range, I think, of diversity in neurodivergent sexuality and gender that I just think is fascinating and just gets me excited because, if you see somebody and your neurodivergent radar goes off, oftentimes my queer radar can go off too. There's also some research that suggests a higher correlation of kink identities among neurodivergent people. So one kind of thought behind this is that certain kinks are also sensory stimulation, right? You've got bondage and impact play, which give you that great proprioceptive input. You've got sensory deprivation, kind of the opposite with blindfolds, maybe headphones. Some people like to have all of that and be tied up and kind of, get that sensory, right? Like you're taking away a sensory experience and you're adding sensory experience through impact play or things like that. So there are quite a few things, particularly in the BDSM sphere, that are like not only probably considered really sexy to a lot of neurodivergent folks, but they're also great sensory stimulation. And then another kind of piece to these correlations that I have noticed is that there may be kind of they may be explained a bit by this neurodivergent disregard for social norms and discrete categories. The neurotypical kind of normative way of looking at sex is that it's these specific acts, and that's, very kind of not regimented necessarily, but it's a set of specific things, and that's, you kind of leave it in that box. And when neurodivergent folks can get kind of expansive about categories and what they mean, then it makes sense to me that that would lead to, right, maybe thinking outside the box about what can be sexy, about what can you bring into the bedroom. And some of these, like kink doesn't have to equal like genital contact sex. So this also really expands what you can do with your sexuality. So maybe the sensory experience of sex with penises and vaginas or any combination of genitalia, maybe that sensory experience feels really yucky, but there are some other non-genital things that turn you on. And that, exploring and affirming that like kink is okay and normal is a great way, once again, to expand people's knowledge of like what they really can access. And I think that's just so important to really emphasize that everybody has the right to enjoy their sexuality in whatever ways that feel good to them. And you don't always know about these less obvious sex acts and kinks and things like that. So really exploring that with your clients. First of all, if you're asking me, I think it's fun. I think it's really fascinating and interesting that, many people experience the sexual response cycle, and it's kind of the same steps, and so many different things can get people there. And I think that's fascinating. I think it's really interesting to hear about people's kinks. And so having those conversations, I think, can be really liberating for people, and removing the shame around them, because that's another piece. I think if people see that, kinks and fetishes are taboo and hush hush, it's just one more thing for neurodivergent folks to feel shame about if they do feel shame for being different. And then this piece here, I'm also very excited about. These are kind of my practical tips that I want to leave you all with in terms of like, what can you bring into your work if you're working with neurodivergent folks and you're, providing them with sex education, like what specific things? So like I said before, kind of having this list of potential sex acts is a great way to introduce the, great place to start. Helping people understand what's out there for them to do. And that helps them, say, okay, this sounds fun. I want to try this. This sounds like really not for me. I don't want to do this. And one great way to kind of formalize this and make it, easy access is to create what's called a want, will, won't list. So I'm going to scooch over to the next slide here. This is an example. I have this linked, the whole thing linked in my resources slide at the end of the show. And so the want, will, won't list, it's, I think, pretty self-explanatory. You take a list of sex acts and you distinguish between what ones you want to do, what are you inclined to do, what will really get you going, things that you're willing to do. Maybe they're not your kind of go-to, but if your partner wants to do them, sure, sounds good. And then your won'ts, your hard no's, your things that, off the list, off the table, we're not going to do them. This list, I think, is really awesome because it provides a super, super wide range of sexual activities. This is just from the first page. It's kissing and all sorts of body parts. I do think it's kind of funny that they put them in alphabetical order and not like, I don't know, if I were making this, I'd probably go like erogenous zones outward, but that's beside the point. It's a long list of sex acts. It starts with kind of the more vanilla ones and it gets pretty kinky down toward the bottom. So it is, I would say, a very kind of comprehensive list of potential sex acts. And then you have the columns on either side for receiving and giving. Maybe you want to, receive certain things and you don't want to give them. And so this gives the opportunity to get really specific about what things you want and are willing to do versus what you won't on both kind of the giving and receiving ends. This is a great exercise to do with kind of by yourself to understand your own wants and needs, and also with a partner. I would, if you do this with a partner, I would recommend getting together once you've filled it out, and then anything that's on either of your want lists, just cross it out. Those are gone, and you just, that's kind of a no questions asked. If it's on your want list, that's a hard no. If you, I would focus mostly on the things that are both on, on both people's want list. Those are, going to be the juiciest, most exciting things for everybody. And then the will list, perhaps, maybe one partner has something on their want list and if one person has it on their will list. That's something that's worth trying for sure. And maybe if both people have something on their will list, then, that might be something to try eventually if you feel like spicing it up. But, if it's kind of second tier, not like what you're really wanting to do, and both people have that on their will list, then maybe it's just kind of something you can skip over for now. So I think this is a great resource. Like I said, the whole list is going to be linked, worth checking out for yourself and showing to your clients. And then some other practical tips, getting back to this slide here. We have, once again, this consent and boundary scripting. So I already talked about developing consent scripts. I also think that creating and practicing nonverbal safe words, establishing, if I can't talk, either because I got a gag in my mouth or because I don't have access to words, how can I show you that like things are good, or I need to stop, or I need to slow down? So developing some sort of like very obvious, doable gesture kind of thing to indicate consent, I think is a useful thing to have prepared ahead of time as well. And this, I think, is a great like microcosm practice exercise to do in the therapy space if you see clients in that capacity, is to help clients build confidence in saying no by offering a hug. Say, hey, do you want a hug? And have them practice saying no, even if they're down for a hug. Just the practice, right, of being in the safe therapeutic space and having someone ask you for consent for a hug, for that physical contact, and then practice saying no. I know for my own neurodivergence, kind of practicing that stuff ahead of time really does make it easier to implement in the moment if it's needed. So that's a great, like, really practical thing you can do quick in the therapy space, just practice that no. And lastly here, I think that social stories for sexual experiences are really useful. I talked a lot about the importance of knowing what to expect, and that's exactly what social stories are for. So we kind of have thought at Holistic about creating some social stories around this. We're in the works trying to figure that out. So we have ideas about things like seeing a sex worker. What does that look like? How does that go? I think a neurodivergent person is going to feel a lot more confident walking into that kind of situation if they know what they're doing or know what to expect. Same with things like going to sex clubs and parties. People might want to do that, explore their kinks in that way, explore their sexuality in that way, but it's hard to maybe feel confident about making it out there without knowing what to expect. There do exist some social stories. I was looking online for them. So this Australian organization called Touching Base has some social stories about seeing a sex worker. They are based in Australia, so the culture around that may look different, but I don't think I have them linked in this, but if you search Touching Base, sex and disability, you should be able to find them. They have physical copies that you can purchase. So I'm really curious about those. I'm not totally sure, can't fully endorse them, but I do know that they're out there. And I think it's really cool that an organization has these like social stories for adults going to see sex workers. All right. We are coming up right at the end of this little presentation, so I'm going to leave us off here with the resources that I talked about. So we have both sex education resources, so Sexplanations, that whole YouTube channel I mentioned before. We also have Research Autism's Sex Ed for Self-Advocates is a super comprehensive online resource that has all sorts of different categories of sex ed that you can kind of self-select and learn about. And it also has resources for creating like a peer-led sex education group. So super useful, particularly if you're working with like young folks and people who maybe are inclined to build a group to work together. I've linked the list for what does it mean to be sexually healthy. Also have linked the PDF of the want will won't list. And then another, I think these would be some good social stories too. There's web comics on a website called Oh Joy Sex Toy that have kind of, lighthearted, easy access comic stories about sexual experiences and things like that. So good for education, good for setting up expectations. And the last little link I have at the bottom of the sex ed resources is a great book called A Quick and Easy Guide to Sex and Disability. It's teeny tiny. It's a little graphic novel written by a disabled creator. And it's just a really kind of open and liberating look at what sex and disability can look like in a very like positive and pleasure oriented way. And then on the other side here, I have the consent and healthy relationship resources. These, I did link the power and control wheels that on the slide. And then I think this love is respect, the third bullet point down, it's a quiz called Is Your Relationship Healthy? That's a really awesome, just like easy check-in. It takes a couple of minutes to fill it out, and it is kind of a checklist of toxic or healthy traits in your relationship. And with that, I feel like I just talked so much and I didn't drink anything. But with that concludes my presentation. So I'm going to stop my share and take your comments, questions, what have you. I see there's a bunch of stuff in the chat.
Yes. Thank you so much, Lydia. Would it be helpful if I summarize some of what happened in the chat?
I think Lydia's frozen.
Ah,
I'm gonna go.
okay.
I'm gonna go run and just see how she's doing in the office because I know she's here. And I'll be right back. But I think that maybe just a discussion. I'm seeing so much on consent and on the sensory aspect and just the idea of asexuality because of like aversions and
Hi.
hey.
That was strange. Y'all just like everybody cut out on me. Sorry. And then Zoom closed. I'm back.
So Lydia, we were just talking about, or I was just bringing up how much in the chat is around the consent and the sensory aspects. And somebody had mentioned that that there was a client who thought maybe they were asexual, and then it turned out it was sensory aversion. And like just how needed all the nuance and like the real granular sort of view of this is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's, when the narrative around what sex looks like is kind of one particular way in so much of our culture, it makes it really difficult to consider the outside possibilities of what can be, as like I said, we don't know what we don't know. So to kind of only see sex as these certain things that kind of inevitably come with those sensory yucks. It can, I think, it can suppress people's ability to explore that stuff fully. And I really love the idea of like kink being not always being kind of like specific to your sex organs and erogenous zones and stuff like that, because it just expands what pleasure can look like. And I think that's just such an important part of this whole conversation. Britt, I would love to give this to every human. And Zach, sorry, I'm looking at the chat now. Zach, thank you for your Portlandia reference. I always joke, like if I'm talking about safe words, I like to talk about cacao. If you're not familiar, the TV show Portlandia did a bit about safe words and consent, and they used the word cacao as their safe word. And it expanded. It started out just being about sex, and then it turned into like so many different things. And then eventually it said cacao to cacao. And they decided that they were using the safe word too much. Robin, I'm going to read this comment because I think it's awesome. What you said, it can be really helpful to talk about what will means for you. So for some people, will could mean I would be willing to try if I'm already turned on, or it could mean I love trying things that excite my partner. Please ask me for these. Or it could mean this will do nothing for me, but that isn't very important to me, and many other things. I think that's a really, really great kind of add-on to the want, will, won't piece. So thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Anybody else have questions, comments?
I have a thought. I know I was the one that had talked about I've had several clients, and as I kind of shared, myself included with that, like, am I asexual, questioning and sensory stuff. What I find really challenging as the therapist and helping people navigate that is trying to be affirming, right? That like some people are simply asexual and there's nothing more to that.
Mm-hmm.
And when somebody brings that up, I don't want to be suggesting like, like maybe you're not, and here's these other things we should consider.
Yeah, like, oh, maybe you haven't tried. Like, oh,
right.
you just, you might not be gay. You haven't tried kissing someone of the opposite, right? Like similar things like that. Yeah.
And I will say, like, and this is obviously anecdotal, but like it's happened. I can't even tell you how many times, like now that I've had this same kind of situation, knowing that clients are neurodivergent, it feels like a piece. And again, when it seems like there's a different flavor, right? Like when these folks are bringing it up, and of course, asexuality has a huge range of what that means, right? And so when folks have brought it up, it's often in the context of like, maybe, but it doesn't, I'm not really sure, but like, I don't, like, so it's like, it's not like they're like, they're feeling very clear about it, right? And as somebody who also, I do a lot of IFS and parts work, and that can impact all of that. And so, I feel like it's just really hard. And I guess I'm looking if people have any good verbiage. It's super hard to navigate that. Like, how do you have those conversations and at least explore and check, when they're questioning, is this a piece, or just kind of naming that with also still staying affirming. And also I think the other place kind of semi-connected with this is, and I was reminded in, like some of Robin's comments, like there are some folks who they don't necessarily enjoy this particular thing, but they enjoy that their partner enjoys it. And then I have a really hard time having those kind of conversations without it starting to feel really icky of like, getting into consent kinds of pieces, because I absolutely do not ever want to be encouraging somebody to do something they're not comfortable with. And we all have differences, right, in relationships and our needs. And so it's just super hard to navigate that. And I feel like a lot of times recommendations are like, hard and fast of you shouldn't say this, you shouldn't say this. And it's just so hard to find the right language to be affirming and yet also acknowledge that some of these nuances are really common for many neurodivergent folks, and not, encouraging people to do anything more than they're comfortable with. And so I don't know if anybody has feedback on like how they can talk about that and make sure all of those needs are met at the same time. I think I'm doing okay now, but of course I just feel nervous, right? Because there's so many of those lines that knowing all of the dynamics and what's happening, it's hard to balance all those pieces.
Yeah, I'm thinking about what the kind of first piece that you talked about like ace folks or ace leaning folks. I'm thinking about that, the like giving people an out, right? So, and kind of setting up the expectations of what the conversation might look like. And so, you know, asking, so you brought this information to me that you might be ace or you're not sure. Like, what do you want to do with that? Is that something you just want to name? Do you want to explore that and what that could mean or look like? And provide, you know, say, if you get uncomfortable or if you're like, hey, I feel like we're pushing too far, just let me know, you know, maybe come up with a word to give them an out. But I think approaching that with curiosity of like, well, what does that mean, right? Are you just like, do genitals gross you out? Like what, you know, what specifically, you know, or is it
Are
just
you
the concept
noticing
in
that makes you
general?
wonder?
Right.
Yeah, like what
And
is it
kind
that
of,
you're noticing? And that's sometimes,
yeah.
you know, my way often is to kind of just say, like, if there's some cues that I'm given, then sometimes I'll say, well, sometimes I've had some clients that have noted, you know, noted that they have some sensory issues. Is that something you've ever considered? And, you
Right.
know, just like casually, not saying it's true for you, I'm just dropping in this little tidbit of information
Right.
and then kind of seeing where they go from that. But
Yeah, and exploring, right, asexuality as a spectrum. And it's like, where do you,
Mhm.
maybe where do you think you sit on that spectrum and how confident do you feel that that's where you sit?
Mhm.
Is that where you always are? Are there ever times when that's not true? And, you know, getting kind of curious in, yeah, a way that it's, that nuance is hard, right? Of not
Yeah.
pushing and saying, well, maybe, you know, maybe you just haven't tried the right thing. But
Mhm.
with the intention of um, just making sure people know all of their options.
Mhm. Yeah, for sure.
Anybody else have thoughts? That other piece you were talking about, I'm still kind of chewing on about the will, what will can look like.
Lydia, one of the things that I sort of like heard in what Bobby Joe was saying was sort of the idea of social constructs related to terminology or identities, of like, how do I know if I fit in this box? How do I know if my relationship fits in this other box? And one of the things that we were talking about sort of just like as a community, was how like I personally don't really know the difference between romantic and platonic love. Like if I have a really good friend who's having a rough day, maybe I'll pick them up with flowers, take them out to dinner, we'll come back to their place and we'll snuggle and watch a movie. And that's not leading towards sex, it's not leading towards a romantic relationship. And so maybe just sort of some advice on when you have a person who's thinking in all these like nuanced and like very specific ways, trying to figure out how they can communicate who they are and what they want to other, of like, you know, the amount of questions that I've had around how do I know, am I pansexual or bisexual? Like, how do I communicate this in the right way? I think that there's a lot of anxiety around that.
Yeah. And I with what you said about like pan versus bi, I think there's that piece I see a lot of like, I feel like that gets complicated with like internet discourse. That in particular, I always kind of, I talk about my philosophy with labels of being just like what feels right. And, you know, it doesn't, you know, if it feels right, then that's what matters most. And you can always, you know, if you have other words to communicate what, you know, makes you pan versus bi, then that's great. And if not, then I think, you know, people don't have to understand to accept it. I know that's not how it's always going to be received by the public, but that's kind of how I would bolster some folks up on that front. And um, oh, I'm losing my train of thought a little bit, but thinking about sexual identity, and like where do I fit? I mean, I just get really curious, and try to normalize, and I'll, you know, maybe give some anecdotal stories about like, well, this is some, you know, I've seen these things maybe in online spheres, and try to get more like lived experience normalization about, you know, also like, I know of people who identify as ace and also as kinky, right? And this maybe like you can hold multiple of those identities at one time. I don't know if that fully answered what you were saying.
Yeah, well, and I think too, that these are social constructs that evolve over time. I think one of the
Mm-hmm.
biggest sort of like sticking points just in the like bi versus pan sort of space is how many people identified as bi decades ago. And for them, it doesn't mean something as restrictive as maybe now people are portraying
Mm-hmm.
it to be, right? Or
Yeah.
if I have a relationship with a friend that some people might interpret as a romantic relationship, but it feels platonic to me, like, how can I sit in that discomfort of like, this is sort of like what I'm calling this at this moment, and it can be transient. I can change my mind if I feel like maybe I'm ace. I can say that I'm ace in this moment. I think it's kind of like when people are sort of talking about, you know, pronouns of like, I hold space a lot for, I think that I want to start using this pronoun, but what if I'm not sure and I change my mind later? And I'm like, great.
Yeah. Then you'll know. Oh my gosh, Megan, I'm gonna have to go at 11. So I would absolutely love to hear it. I don't know if now would be a good time to switch to that or not. Maria, I'm still thinking about, some of your thoughts too. But I just saw Megan's chat that you have a kink related consult. So if now is a good time to move along to that, then I'd be happy to stick around until 11.
If you have anything to sort of like follow up what I had said,
Yeah.
discomfort, then that would be great. And then we can transition by turning off the recording and jumping to Megan and starting off the consult.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think especially like that defining, right, what are your expectations and what are your hopes out of this relationship, especially when, like you said, that example of getting your friend flowers and taking them to dinner can look or feel a little nebulous. My go-to is often kind of being asking like, well, what would happen if you just like asked explicitly, right? And that can feel really uncomfortable to be so upfront. And also, I mean, is just speaking some of the unspoken stuff that we're already trying to figure out, right? Like, what does this look like? How do I want it to look? And to, if you have the trust with someone, especially if you have this platonic bond with them, to say, this is where I'm at. This is platonic to me, but I want to check in. Like, are we on the same page here? What are your wants and needs out of this? I think it can feel foreign to, well, maybe not for everybody. For neurotypicals, it can feel foreign to just like be upfront about that and to put it out into the world. And I think there's this fear that there's going to be like, repercussion for like just being honest about your wants and needs. And I try to challenge that when I can and say like, well, what if you just asked? What if you just, stated where you were at? Maybe that's not going to work in every situation, but I think that's where my curiosity tends to lead, is like, what would that look like?